so indulge me. Let me get on my soapbox. As a person who has an ACE score of 9 out of 10, as somebody who's experienced an incredible amount of childhood adversity, I get so put off when people call these maladaptive behaviors. So that's fine. It's a fine descriptive word, but I'm going to tell you, every one of these behaviors kept me safe and alive when I was a kid, and my mom would come home drunk with a man I'd never met before. And even though I was 4 or 5 years old, and so I couldn't logically map out what was happening, I knew to expect betrayal and go hide in my closet until that evening was over, right? So that I would be safe. So I resent the maladaptive tone of it. They're the beautiful ways your brain keeps you safe and alive when there's threats and harms around you. But what I will admit to and will readily confess is most of these behaviors and ways of coping aren't so helpful year 25 of my marriage, right? When my husband just wants us to put a budget together for the month and I'm coming in defensive and ready to go. And they probably weren't behaviors that served me well when I was trying to figure out algebra in ninth grade, or when I was, maybe in a situation where somebody like, so just that idea, like that's just my soapbox for a minute, right? Like I get that these are behaviors that don't serve me well all the time, but in the spaces I needed them, they kept me safe and alive. Here's what we want to know is, if we nurture hope, does your trust go back up? Does your expectation of betrayal go down? We've got a study right now in Oklahoma of women who are incarcerated. So in the state of Oklahoma, we have the highest rate of female incarceration in the world, not just the United States, in the world. So in my state, we have more moms who are in prison. We have more kids who have a mother in prison than anywhere else in the world here in Oklahoma. And most of these women are short sentencing. It's usually drug-related crimes. They're going to go home. And let's imagine for a minute how much shame and a lack of trust are going to impact her ability to parent really well as she transitions back to that role, right? Like you can map that out with me, right? So what we've been doing is working with our Department of Corrections to see if we can teach the skills of hope to women while they're incarcerated, so that as they transition out, their sense of shame goes down, their expectation of betrayal goes down, they're better able to use their coping skills, so that goes up. We've been studying that for a couple of years now, and it turns out it is. When we nurture hope, shame goes down. So for us, when we think about hope and being trauma responsive, is can we nurture hope and these trauma symptoms become something we don't have to use to manage our day-to-day lives anymore? All right, so really quick in summary, what I'm talking about is we think about programs and services on this kind of array, that we meet children and families on this kind of journey of their life. And most of the time where we meet folks is they're somewhere between 0 and -8, right? If you said, how are you doing today, with -8 being the worst you could be to 0 being neutral, where are you? And we meet them somewhere where they're down here and they're suffering. Things are hard. And what we do through programs and services is we move people up to this 0 point, right? Where the risk, if all we're doing is risk reduction, then what we're doing is moving someone from a -8 to a -2, or from a -8 to a 0. I'm going to stop again and remind everyone, I am a social worker and I know how hard it is to meet somebody at a -8 and move them up to 0, right? Where they're not great, but the risk is gone, is hard work. And I'm so glad that we do that work. But do we have an opportunity, or should we make and create an opportunity where we don't just move people from suffering to surviving the adversities of their life, but we actually begin to build some capacity for them to at least turn towards this +8 part of their life and look at what does it mean to thrive. Maybe we don't even build that service. I'd love if we could build the services out where we help people get there, but do we have an opportunity to build skills so that we don't just bring people from this -8 state, leave them here at 0, and just say, don't go back? I think about in child welfare, like fundamentally, that's what we do. We need them when there's a ton of risk. We reduce all that risk. We get them back, reunify the parent with the child, and say, just don't go back to where you were, right? Where do we have an opportunity to turn that parent over here towards this +8 and say, let's talk about how to get up there, right? And how do you build that capacity? And hope is the way we get to that piece. All right, so I've talked for 20 minutes and we haven't even talked about hope yet. So let me get into the big agenda. But I always want to preface the work, because I got to tell you again, if I were in your seat and you came in and started talking to me about hope and you hadn't looked at it in the context of trauma, I would have logged off by now. Like, give me tools that work in the hard places that I do this work day to day. So in the chat, here's what I want you to do. When you hear the word hope, how do you define it? There's no wrong answer, but let's get some ideas going. What does it mean to be hopeful today? And while you're doing that in the chat, I want you to think about the second question. When you think about hope, is hope a feeling? Is it one of your emotions? You're feeling hopeful today? Or is hope a cognitive state? You're thinking hopeful thoughts. I'm having hopeful thoughts for myself. Which one do you think it is, a feeling or a cognitive state? Good. Okay, I'm seeing lots of great definitions. The feeling of clear. Okay, people are saying they're seeing it's a feeling. I'm getting definitions like it's something is possible. Things are going to eventually get better. Expecting better outcomes, possibility. That's such a big piece of the definition. You're right. Positivity and faith. I see that. Cognitive. Okay, I see you. I see some both in there. Good. All right. Thank you, by the way, for all of you for putting stuff in the chat. All right. You all have really good definitions. You have a good idea of what hope is. What I think there's value in, though, is if we, particularly within an organization or a community, have a universal definition so that when we're talking about the science of hope, we're defining it the same way. And so let's create that for ourselves today. So the way we do it, the way the researchers have defined hope, is that hope is a belief that your future will be better than today, where you're at right now, and you have the power to make that future happen. If you don't love the word power, because I kind of don't love the word power myself, it's that I have the ability, the strategies, the capacity to make that future happen. I can make that future happen, or I could even make that future happen. So hope is a belief that the future will be better than today, and I can make that future happen. I have control over those things. A couple of really important things about this definition. If we just stop at the first part, a belief in a better future, we put a period there, that's optimism. All right. And so optimism is having a positive expectation for the future. But what we know about optimism is that people can want a better future. But if they don't have this second part, the power to make that future possible, the strategies they need to make that future possible, then optimism doesn't do you a whole lot of good, right? Optimism can be really important, but you have to have those second part, or else you're just wanting something else. Wanting for something is a good first step, but what we want to do is extend beyond optimism into actually assuring that people know how to make a future possible. The other thing that's really key in this definition is the question I just asked you: is this an emotion or a cognition? And it turns out in the scientific research, we agree. It's not even debated, which is kind of rare, but in science, we agree. Hope is cognitive. You think hopeful thoughts. So here's why this is exciting and matters. If hope was a feeling, then at best, what we could do is teach you how to recognize it and manage it, right? Just like you do with anger, or joy, or love, or passion, or whatever your feelings you're having, right? So we have less of a role to play in people's emotions. But anything that's cognitive, if you think hopeful thoughts, then that means you're taught how to do it. Right? It means it's malleable. And whatever thoughts you have, if they're inaccurate or untrue, we can correct them, right? So what it means is hope is something that you're taught to be. You are taught to be hopeful. People model hopefulness for you, and you learn how to adapt and be hopeful yourself. And where I love this is that means I have a role to play in your hope. You have a role to play in other people's hope. You can model and enhance and help people build their capacity to believe that the future is better, can be better than today, and they can make that future possible. But here's the counterpoint to that. If hope is cognitive, if we've learned to be hopeful, then it also would hold that people didn't get taught how to be hopeful, right? Like you see, like for me, that was the big thing when I started reading all this, and I started thinking about, particularly for me, children and youth in foster care. I was like, where's this happening? Because I can certainly point to ways in the system where I think we probably rob kids of hope. But where are we really intentionally teaching children or parents or anybody to be hopeful, right? All right, so how do we do it? If I'm going to teach you to be hopeful, here's what I'm going to do. The first thing in the cornerstone of hope is that you have to be able to set some sort of a goal for your future. If the belief that the future can be better than today and I can make that future happen, then I have to see something that I want in that future, right? So goal setting is a word. What do I want my future to be? Think about the domains of your life, right? So we're not talking these big, I'd like to run a marathon someday, although that's a perfectly wonderful goal if that's what you want to set. But most of the people we meet, what do they want their future to be? Is a big important question, right? What is it? What does parenting your kids well mean? What does being in a safe relationship look like? What's having a good day at school really mean if that's the goal that you have? So in a hope-driven practice model, we're going to really lean into letting other people define for themselves the goals that they have, apart from treatment program and intervention goals. What do you want your future to be? And we need to nurture and rehearse that idea. Kids in particular have a really hard time imagining their future self, even if they haven't had any trauma. But if trauma has been invited into that environment, they are in survival mode. And survival is about today. And where do we help people think about tomorrow, right? How do we teach the skill for that to even start to happen? So goal setting happens first. After somebody is able to identify a goal that they have, then our job is, if we're teaching them to be hopeful, is that we would rehearse with them, well, how do you find multiple pathways or strategies that you could take to get to that goal, right? The characteristic of people who score really high in hope is they're able to identify goals that matter to them, and then they find multiple ways to get to the goal, not just one route. Hopeful people are innovative and adaptive, so they can figure out lots of different ways. So functionally, then, as we nurture hope, we're actually teaching problem solving skills, right? Our hope and problem solving are tied together. The third part of hope is what I think is the harder part to do for myself and to do with others, and that is agency. Having agency means I have some control over this thing. I can act on it. I'm motivated. It's a lot of different things. So I'm going to use a substitute word in here of willpower or mental energy is what I want you to think about. So in a hope setting, I'm going to be recognizing and identifying goals, finding and teaching, rehearsing multiple ways to get to that goal, and then actually spending some time thinking about the kind of willpower motivation it's going to take to pursue those pathways in pursuit of that goal, and maybe even building strategies around that. But once I've rehearsed those with you, if I'm helping you build your hope, then you have that sense of like, oh, the goal is possible. The future is possible, and I can make that future happen. That's where that cognitive process comes from. So if we wanted to do hope work, we would start to think about, how do we use this language? How do we add this in to the way we do intakes and case management and those programs? How do we teach hope while we're teaching prevention programming? Because for prevention programming to work, people have to imagine themselves in the future, right? I think about all these incredible people that go out and are trying to keep our kids from vaping now, which seems to be, by the way, the hardest thing you can do, unfortunately, because our young kids get a lot of access to vaping. Well, fundamental to keeping a kid from vaping in middle school is they have to imagine themselves as a 30-year-old. And what do they want their lung health and physical health and body health to be and brain health to be at age 30? It's hard to do when you're 12, right? So if we teach hope, we have a better likelihood of the skills they need to also see themselves in the future. Now, the good news is I could stop there and say, you have now learned about hope. One of the things that I actually really love is, on paper, hope is pretty simple. We work in complex systems that have complex interventions, and it is absolutely okay if every once in a while we have something that's pretty easy to do, right? And so goals, pathways, willpower. Here's the piece I want you to do. This is a piece, actually, for me, this is a problem solving grid. I want you to think about this every time you're kind of in the space, thinking and questioning, am I doing hope work? I want you to see this image, this triangle with the 3 tenets of hope tied together. Because here's what we know. In order for you to be hopeful, to believe that the future can be better than your past and you can make that future happen, you have to have all 3 of these there, right? If you have a goal and you don't have any pathways to get there, or you have a goal and you have pathways, but the pathways that are in front of you are way too hard for what you can take care of right now in your life, then what you have at that point in time is a wish. Anytime you're missing one piece of this, you have a wish. And I think one of the most critical things that I've walked away as I think about my career of being in a helping role with other people is how often I think we did a great job with 1 or 2 of these elements. And I didn't know how to distinguish between I've got somebody wishing for something versus somebody's being hopeful about something, right? And so this gives us a way to check back and make sure that we didn't just put together a plan or a strategy in which the person who's doing it with me says, that looks great, but it ain't ever going to happen, right? Like that's their thought. We need them to be looking at this plan and saying, that looks great and that's possible, right? Possibility is what hope is. The other thing, though, is why this is important is I think that at some level, most of the problems you face, there's a benefit for you to think through this image whenever you hear a problem. Here's what I mean. I think that a lot of times when you're encountering something, a barrier, an obstacle, that you can go back and think, okay, do I have a goal problem here? Is the goal unclear, uncertain, not aligned? Do we have pathways problem? Are the pathways difficult or unsure or not even, we don't even know what they really are? Or do we have a willpower problem here? So here's what I mean. Imagine you're working in a child welfare agency with a mother whose children have been removed from her, and she says, I want my kids back. You all just won't let me have them. Right? She stated a problem statement. Well, I want my kids back is a goal statement to me. It's a very clear goal statement. I want my kids back. You all won't let me have them is for me to sort out, is she saying she's got pathway issues or willpower issues? And here's why this also matters, is because if I think it's a willpower issue and I start coaching her to get going, and what she's saying is, I don't know how to take the bus and get to the clinic, we have eroded trust and disrupted a healthy, you know what I mean? Like, it's not good when we get this wrong. And so when we're focused on these three tenets, we have a better opportunity to get clarity so that when we're offering help in the right way. Right. So this is something I want you to think about, is how do I use Hope Science to problem solve with people? The other thing is, this can be really an important thing. What's critical in hope is that the belief that my future can be better and I can make that future happen, is it also gives us a space to help people distinguish between things they have control over and things they do not have control over. Because as much as we wish that everything were in our control, there are things that just simply aren't. So for example, a youth in foster care says to me, I say, what's your goal? And they say, my goal is to go home. I want to be home with my family. Man, I want that for him too. I want you to have that thing that you want. But do you actually have any pathways? Does a kid in foster care have any pathways to get reunified with their parents? Probably not. It's almost entirely up to their parents to do things. So if I were working with that kid, I would draw this triangle out and say, you know what, I want that for you too. But let's talk about, goals are things that we have control over, and pathways and the willpower to manage. And right now, you don't have any control over that. So what can help is right now is let's focus on things you can control. So what's a goal you have for you? And how do we build pathways? And how do we help that young person focus their attention on not just things they're wishing for, which can cause and feel like a constant state of frustration when you can't get your needs met. False hope is where I want something really bad and I'll never have a pathway to make that happen. So it gives us a tool to talk about it, but then also to reshift the attention back into saying, but why don't we set some goals in some places you can control? All right, so let's talk about then trauma and adversity. What do we know trauma does to hope? Well, here's the really good news. You can be high ACE score, high trauma, and high hope. They don't automatically erase one another. And I think we all know that instinctively, right? Because we've met people who've been through really hard things and they're flourishing in their life, right? But we certainly know that trauma and adversity have a role to play in the way our cognitive thoughts about our future shape out. So here's what do we know. Number one, and this is probably the most important thing I think that we've seen in our research, is that for somebody who's experienced high rates of trauma and high adversity, so they're currently stressed or they've had a lot of stress throughout their life, they are far more likely to set goals, but those goals are avoidant goals instead of achievement goals. So here's what I mean by that. They set goals that are to make sure that nothing else happens that's horrible. Like they're goals that are like, how do I survive today? How do I not let any more harm come to my family? How do I not let any more damage come to my relationship? How do I not let any more financial strain happen in my household? How do I, so they're very avoidant goals. One thing I want to make sure you really hear, avoidant goals, not having anything and not having any more harm come to my family is a good and worthy goal. So don't hear me say, please do not hear, I'm not saying avoidant goals are bad. Avoidant goals are meaningful and purposeful goals that help you avoid more risk, damage, and loss in your lives. But what I also think is important to know is that if what you are is through your stress constantly setting avoidant goals, then all of your goal setting is rooted in fear and worry. And it's really hard to get to well-being when every goal you set is rooted in fear and worry. And so how do we help people move from setting these avoidant goals all the time into achievement? And I don't think it's reframing goals. I think we help people naturally move themselves into that space. So how do we get people, as they begin to get through and survive today, as they're surviving through this stress, where do we see them by building goals, pathways, and willpower around those survival goals, around that achievement or avoidant? Where do you actually get to start to see them being a little bit more aspirational every day? Right? Like it begins, I'm going to survive today and think about tomorrow, right? And set a goal for something I want tomorrow. The other thing we know about goal setting, though, is that most people don't come in, you don't sit down with someone and say, well, what's a goal you have for yourself or something you want? And they're like, I've been in a really avoidant mind space lately. And this is like, we don't talk like that to each other, right? I think about, I've got two now adult children, but when they were young, they're a year apart in school. So at the beginning of the school year, we'd say, what do you want school to be like this year? Like we did the parent talk, and they would both say, I'm going to have a great year in school this year. Right? So they would both say, my goal is to have a great year in school this year. I got to tell you, for one of those children, our daughter, who's now a data manager over in our Medicaid system and finishing a PhD, when she said, I want to have a great year in school, she meant AP courses, student councils, straight A's, marching band excellence. Like a great year in school for her was an achievement goal. She had her eyes on a prize. Her brother, equally as smart, his goal when he said, I want to have a good year in school, it was never, ever an achievement statement for him. What he meant was, I'm going to have a good year in school. And what I mean by that is I'm going to do just enough so that you all don't take away my privileges, that I don't get in trouble, and I keep you happy. And so whatever it takes for me to get there is what I'm going to do in school this year. Both are good goals. For my son to say, I'm going to do what it takes to keep the minimum standard at bay and then get to go do what I want to do is a perfectly good and worthy goal. As much as I may have wanted it to be an achievement goal, it was a worthy goal, right? Here's the thing. They need very different pathways to be able to accomplish their goal. And at some point, I hope that our son would have moved to being achievement. He didn't, but he did finish high school and he's still very brilliant. All right, so here's what we need to do is we need to ask more questions about the goals people have so that we can understand the nature of that goal so that when we're building pathways, they align with the goal pursuit. I do not think you should reframe goals. So if a kiddo says to you, you say, what's a goal you have? And this kid says, I don't want to fight anymore with my sister. That's a great goal. What I was taught to do in my education was to reframe that and to say, oh, so you want to have a great relationship with your sister. That is not what that kid just said to me. That kid just said, I want to not fight with my sister. And so my job's going to be to give them some pathways that can help them not fight with their sister. And what we know is that hope begets hope. And so once he starts to have some success with avoiding getting in trouble for fighting with his sister, that relationship itself can begin to emerge and he can start to set some achievement goals around that. But we don't want to flip it over and say, oh, what you mean is you want to have a great relationship with your sister. Because when you say that, that person's like, you're not listening to me. I don't trust you. You're going to let me down, right? So trauma response. Now, the other thing then is we know that trauma messes with our pathways thinking. What we know is that we think we're really good problem solvers, but research suggests we are not. We're actually really great problem solvers when we're in distress. That what happens when we're in distress is we actually no longer want to think about all of the choices we have in front of us. When we get into high adversity and high stress, what you actually want is everything to get and just tell me what to do. Like we want to take all the choices we have, narrow them down and say, okay, tell me the pathway. How am I supposed to solve this problem? Give me the answer to this, right? In distress, people don't think through all of the ways. That's emotionally exhausting for them to do. So that means when people come in for services, they want you to tell them what they need to do, and they want to be able to walk out the door and do that. But here's the problem with that is if I have just given you a way to solve the problem, then what happens for people who haven't had their hope nurtured very well, or they haven't been taught to be hopeful, is when they have a goal and they've set out on a pathway because they've narrowed down all of their choices and they hit a barrier along the way. Then what happens is in their thoughts, they think, well, then this goal must not be for me, right? That's hopelessness, is the future is not possible. Versus for those of us that have had our hope nurtured, and we use this cognitive skill all the time, is I may pick a pathway, but when I hit a barrier, I'm more easily prepared to recognize that I've got a barrier to a pathway, that the goal is in fact still possible. I've just got to find another way around it. I like to think of pathways as like Google Maps. If you're going from Chicago to St. Louis, it's probably going to give you three options of how to get there on Google Maps, at least two, right? And one of them is going to make the most sense. One of them's reasonable. One of them is like, why would you go through Cincinnati to get to St. Louis? But okay, Google, that's a choice, right? That's what happens for people who've had their hope nurtured. They're kind of always in that kind of, let me open it up and think about all the ways to get there. But it is not like something you're born with or don't have. You were taught to think that way. So at a minimum, in a hope-driven practice environment, what I want you doing is helping people recognize the goals they want, understanding whether they're achievement avoidant, help them thinking about short-term strategies to that goal, right? But then I want you, at a minimum, constantly rehearsing with them. Here's a pathway to get here, but I need you to hear me. I've got multiple ways to get to this goal. And if you set out to go solve this problem and the pathway I just gave you gets blocked or interrupted, you come back. I've got other ways. Like at a minimum, we need to say that over and over and over again. Ideally, we would be in a position where we help people think of 3 different ways that they could solve that problem. But remember, when we're in distress, we narrow down our choices and we want to be told what's the one way to get there. Now, the third thing is that trauma and adversity absolutely drain our mental energy. At the heart and soul, what trauma and adversity do is they tend to become our ruminating thoughts, right? Ruminating thoughts are these ideas that you have that you just kind of play over and over and over, usually about your past or about how your past is going to predict your future, right? So you start to think, well, people like me, this is how I experienced this teacher or this classroom or this counseling center. And so this must be how all counselors are. If I had this negative experience, then I expect something. So we know rumination is, for the most part, really bad for us. The more time we spend kind of replaying the history of our lives and then using that to predict what our future is going to look like, if it's negative, it's really bad for us. And so what trauma does is it gives us the screenplay to that problem, right? It's like, oh, I stress bad things happen to me. I expect betrayal. I can't trust people who should be trustworthy. Even if things go well, you're going to let me down. Like that's the cognitive rehearsal that we know happens for people who've had a lot of trauma. So as we nurture hope, we want to call attention to that. We want to get people where they can talk about those thoughts they have and kind of disrupt it. We also know things like nutrition, sleep, and rest matter, right? That they really, really matter. That willpower isn't just something you have or don't have. Willpower is limited. You only have so much any day to spend. I like to use the word mental energy here because I think this is important. I think that we readily accept we only have so much physical energy. We all recognize we need to go to bed, we need to rest. If we were in a building together and I said, let's go run some laps and just stop whenever you're tired, we would stop at different points in time, right? But eventually we would all stop, even the marathon runners in the group. They might go all day, but they would stop eventually because physical energy taps out. I think we treat willpower, we're so cruel to each other about our willpower because we act like if you wanted to, you would. And that's not true. I could want to run a marathon today, but I haven't conditioned myself to be able to do that. And our mental energy is just the same. So when we're nurturing hope, we're giving attention to all of those things. We're finding sources of motivation. We're understanding past success informs future success, but we're also thinking about nutrition and rest and sleep and all of those things. And even just having a conversation about, gosh, that's a really great goal, but this is going to be hard. How will you reserve your energy so you can get this done? Right? That's what a hope-driven relationship looks like. Right. I'm going to move to the next slide. So pretend you didn't see that. Let me ask you in the opposite. I've made some really bold claims here today by saying that hope is one of the strongest predictors of your well-being. Sometimes I think it helps if we just step back from that a little bit, because it would be natural for you to think, well, yeah, but then there's all these other things that help me be well. And you're right. There's a lot of things that are assigned to our well-being. But out of all of the things that are in the research, hope is one of the strongest predictors of well-being. So let's flip the coin. What's hopelessness? Go ahead and drop some words in the chat. What is hopelessness? Despair, empty, defeat. I can't do anything. Yeah, feeling defeated, stagnation, having no direction, fear, being lost. All right. See, if you're struggling a little bit to think about, well, hope's important, but there's lots of things that help you get to well-being. It isn't nearly as difficult for you to map through how powerfully destructive hopelessness is, right? Like hopelessness, it is really hard to be at well-being when you're in despair and disbelief and feeling worthless. And so here's what we know. The loss of hope usually shows up in kind of this incremental process like place. That you may have a goal, you're hopeful, you have a future that you want to make that future happen. But as you start on that journey towards that future and you start to encounter barriers, burdensome systems, difficult or demanding people, pathways that just get blocked, any of that stuff that happens in your journey to your goal, your first natural human response to that is it's actually going to make you really angry. You're going to be mad. It makes me mad. I had this goal I want. All I needed to do was catch a bus and the bus was running 20 minutes late and I missed a dot. Like that anger piece is the natural response you have when your hope starts to get robbed. But here's a little gift that I got from this research that I hope you see it as a gift for yourself too. Anger is the closest thing to hope. When you're working with somebody and they are coming in to tell you something and they are really, really mad, I want you to go back to that triangle and think, are they telling me about a goal problem, a pathways problem, or a willpower problem? But the fact that they've come to you and told you about something and they're mad about it means they see you as somebody who can help them fix that problem. And that's a gift. Not all anger is righteous. I don't want to make that claim, right? But oftentimes when we can think about when your kid comes home from school venting or your friend calls you up to complain about something because they're angry, it's because they see you as somebody who can help them get that back in alignment. Anger is the closest thing to hope. But after you continuously try to figure this out and try to continue to pursue the goal, the next thing that we see that happens is this kind of sense of urgency starts to develop, like where you cognitively start to think like something's got to give. I've got to be able to have this thing happen or I've got to walk away from it, right? And so when urgency starts to creep in, then we start to consider pathways that may be dysfunctional or not as useful for us, right? And so when that happens, then we're more likely to do and take a pathway that is desperate, and that's despair. Where do you see desperation in your work? Like, think about that for a minute. What does despair look like in your work? And is it where people have goals that they want, but the pathways they start to choose in order to get to that goal just don't serve them very well, or might even harm or hurt them, or could potentially hurt the people they love and care for? It's interesting that when we say, what's the loss of hope? Despair is the most common answer we get. It's like, oh, it's despair. And while it's certainly, we're getting very close to hopelessness, even in a state of despair, people still desire a goal for themselves. They just are losing the strategies to get there. So hopelessness is this next state down, and it's apathy. Apathy, hopelessness, is the belief that the future has already been determined. And so nothing that you're going to say or do, or that we're going to do here together, is going to make a difference. So why bother? Why engage? Why come back again for more services? Why tell you even what my needs are? I think about kids that go into like boys and girls clubs, and those boys and girl club leaders work hard to find them an activity and get them involved. And they sit the whole time up against a wall and do nothing. Why are they doing it? Well, maybe they're shy. I mean, there's a lot of things, but one way we could think about it is, has that child decided the future's already been determined and nothing in this boys and girls club is going to make a difference? When we think about, we bring families into a parenting meeting or planning meeting, and we say, what do you want? What do you want for the family? And they shrug at us. Well, it's probably that they don't have goals for their family. They probably do. But in this moment, they don't see the future's possible. So why tell you what I want for myself? So I think this is the other thing I want to give you is I want you to use this as a problem solving strategy for yourself. Where do you see people that are angry, and how do you build possibility back into that and clean up those barriers? How do you understand and respond to urgency and understand despair and what despair looks like? How do you recognize it and help people get back into pathways that are healthy and safe? And where you do encounter apathy, how do you begin to find some goal that they believe there's still possibility in, so that you can teach them how to bring hope back into their life? How do you model it? This is why peer mentor programs are so powerful, right? Is that when you're in a state of despair and apathy and somebody comes in the room and says, I was just like you 2 years ago, and now I'm healthy, well, and my family's thriving, man, that's powerful, right? It moves me out of that apathy into possibilities there. We believe that engagement in programs and services, when people come into wherever it is you are, help seeking, whether they're forced to be there or not, but they open that door, I think their hope has been activated. The question is, how do we nurture and sustain it? I think a person who comes into a domestic violence shelter and opens the door, that they have, at least to some degree, a belief that the future can be better than their past. And this shelter is a way to keep themselves safe, this program or this service. The question is, how do we continue to nurture and build on that hope? And so this gives you a way to look at that and think about it. I'm going to show you a couple quick research studies, then we're going to do some Q&A time. So I'm going to give you a chance to ask some questions here. This is a survey we did in the state of Washington. It's the Healthy Youth Survey. The CDC does these in every state, but in your state, you're allowed to add like 10 or 12 questions. So the state of Washington actually decided to measure hope in the schools. By the way, if you're really interested in hope in schools, if you're here from a school setting, Gallup has an entire division of Gallup that's devoted to schools, and hope science is a critical foundation of that work. So you can go find lots of stuff about hope in schools from the Gallup folks. You can get it from us too, but they've done the best of it. Okay, so among these kids, we pulled out just the eighth graders because the whole group is like 15,000 kids, but we looked at the ACE scores of the kids in eighth grade, and we could see that blue means the kids had 0 ACEs, orange means they had 1 or more adversities. So we could see in this sample of youth that obviously kids could be high hope and have ACEs, right? Now, there's a difference. That's, right under 60% of kids who reported high hope had 0 ACEs, right? Whereas 32% of the kids who said they had high hope had 0 ACEs. So hope, you can have hope and high adversity. But look, when we get down at this other end, is that we could really see that children who had and said they had no hope at all, the future's been determined and nothing's going to make a difference for me, they were very much more likely to have had adversity in their life, right? So we know trauma kind of arose at the goal setting pathways problem. But your ACE score isn't maybe the thing I tell you we're always most interested in. We're interested in well-being. So what does well-being mean for kids in 6th through 12th grade? Well, grades, being able to pass, being able to read, write, be able to pass school, be able to get an education is critical for our well-being in adulthood. And so here's what we could see is, look at this difference between a kid being no hope to being even slightly hopeful to the likelihood that they're failing school. It drops significantly. Now, do high hope kids fail school? Yeah, chemistry happens to the best of us, right? Like, hope isn't a magic eraser to your problems, but you're far less likely to be failing in school when your hope is high, versus kids who say they have no hope are far more likely to be failing school. See this nice linear relationship? This is what we always want to see in research, but I want you to forget everything about that. What I want you to pay attention to is look at the difference of just moving a kid from no hope to slightly hopeful. This is moving a child who's in the mindset of the future's been determined and nothing's going to make a difference, and just getting them to the mindset where they go, I don't know, maybe. Like, that level of commitment to future possibility is what I'm talking about, reduces the likelihood that they're failing so significantly, it's mind-blowing, right? And if we can get that kid who's like, I don't know, maybe, to be like, maybe, like just those little dips, right? That's like that moderately hopeful kid. It cuts their risk of failing in half. Right. So what I want you to see is, you don't have to take somebody who's hopeless and move them to totally hopeful to see good things. Just move the needle. Focus on just moving that needle, and good things follow every time. We've got over 100 studies that show that. This is just one illustration. But I'm a social worker, so you getting good grades in school is great. I understand that that's important. As a parent, it certainly mattered to me. But here's the thing I care about as a social worker. I want to know about your thoughts about your life. And so we asked in that study, it asked kids, have you made a plan for a suicide for yourself in the last year? And here's what we could see. The kids who had no or low hope were absolutely the most likely to say, yeah, I've thought about it. I've thought about it. Do high hope kids think about suicide? Yeah, because mental health's a real thing and our kids need our help, right? But look at this moving the needle outcome. To have a kid who's in the mindset of the future's been determined and nothing's going to matter, kind of makes sense that suicide then would start to become a strategy for that. But if we can move that kid into that next phase where they're thinking, I don't know, maybe something could be better. Like that's that move from no hope to slightly hopeful. It statistically and significantly reduces the likelihood that they've thought about suicide. So we think about suicide prevention programming, you think about suicide intervention. Our idea is while you're doing that work, teach the skill of hope in the midst of that, right? Like literally go in and do exercises that help young people think through, okay, how do I set a goal for myself? How do I figure out multiple ways to get there? What is that cognitive map process I have to have? Because I got to tell you, as a mama, like I see this as a social worker, but I also am a mom of a young person. I'm going to do everything I can to put her in that low risk category every single day if I can, right? And I don't know a lot of ways to do it that have the same results of what we see as nurturing her imagination that the future is going to be better than today and she can make her future happen. It keeps her safe, right? So here's one last study I want to show you. This is among foster youth. We asked the youth in Tennessee, they were 14 to 18 years old. We were able to survey them. The state here, and I said Tennessee because I lived there 20 years. I was here in Oklahoma when I did this study. We were able to survey our youth here in Oklahoma, and here's what we asked them. Is your caseworker, so permanency worker, somebody that checks in on them once a month or a couple times a month, is your permanency worker somebody who nurtures your hope? And so the questions they got asked are things like, my caseworker helps me figure out goals I have for my future. My caseworker is somebody who helps me find pathways or strategies to get to that. My caseworker helps me problem solve when I need it. Even when things are hard, I know I can call on my caseworker. They nurture my willpower. So we asked them a set of questions about, does my caseworker help me do goals, pathways, and willpower? And here's what we could see, that when youth scored their caseworker higher for being a hope nurturer, their own hope score was higher. So here's what I want you to know. You matter. What you do and how you model and you talk about the future and that you nurture hope, it is something that others learn from you in profound ways. It was significantly different among youth who said, no, my caseworker doesn't do that for me, and their own hope score was lower. But hope isn't the outcome. What's an outcome for a teenager in foster care? Doing well in school. And so what we could do is we could plot out statistically with these kids, and the ones who said, yeah, my caseworker is somebody who nurtures my hope, they reported having better school results. They were getting better grades. They were less likely to be in trouble. They understood that reported school as being something that was important to them. Now, I get that what you might be saying is, well, yeah, isn't that just like kids who do go in school tend to have better relationships, tend to be easier to get along with? So in our model, it's a path model. So we structure the model. So we're testing every direction these variables could be going. This is the relationship. So here one is, you matter. One of the things people say to us all the time is, I only have an hour a month with somebody. How could I possibly nurture hope? And this study lets us point back to you and say, you can do it. In an hour a month, you can nurture somebody's hope. But for me, what I really want you to think about is what happens then if, while the caseworker may only be with you for an hour a month, what happens if we also teach the foster parents how to do that? What if your pediatrician understands what hope is? What if you then go into a school where hope is the core value and the core tenet of everything they do there? How do we then protect and prevent and care for some of our most vulnerable kids? I think we can replace this screen with everything that you do. Whatever client or system or community you serve, put them up there where that circle says youth hope. And I want you to think about you as a driver of that hope. What's the outcome that comes with it? And I bet you we have a research study that shows that those are connected. The power of hope is that we can teach it. We can model it. I can let you borrow mine if you need it. I also think, though, that hope is one of the best descriptions of the work you do. I mean, what a way for you to anchor in and think about, what do I do every day? You do hope. Your job is to help people get goals, find pathways to do it, and nurture their willpower. So by no means, please don't hear me say you've never done hope before in your life. I think it's the best description of the work you do. But I think it's really powerful when we all do it together and we're using a common definition and a common language, and we're getting really intentional about it together. When we kind of develop this and say, hey, we're not just trauma informed here, we're hope driven. We think about how to introduce hope regularly. We think about goal setting and pathways and using that language as much as we can with both ourselves and our clients. Like in my treatment team, we are able to distinguish between when we just don't know any more pathways to this child's future needs versus there is no future for this child. Like we know those distinctions for ourselves because we're hope driven. We think about, and our job is we come in and work with agencies. We've been in Oklahoma, Virginia, Iowa. We're having some conversations in Utah and hope to see us starting there. We've got some projects in Tennessee and Washington where we're coming in and thinking about what would client engagement look like if it were hope driven? What does assessment look like if hope gets layered in? I don't think hope is an initiative you go over here and do on top of all your other work. I think hope becomes the way you layer into all of your programs and services until you're practicing in which hope is the driver of that work, because hope is one of the best predictors of your well-being. And so that's the science of hope. Thank you for letting me tell you about it. Let me use our remaining time to, and I don't, Mike, if you're going to facilitate or you just want me to, however you want me to open that up, but I'd love to use our remaining time to ask and answer questions you have.
I think we have Constance and Earl. They're going to be scanning the chat for questions they're going to ask you. And just to let people get a couple minutes and get some of those questions together, I wanted to ask you a question. I was really struck by the comment, agency without pathway is a wish. And as I was thinking about your description of what that meant, I found myself thinking about motivational interviewing as maybe a particular set of really concrete skills and techniques to get to that pathway. Is there a relationship between motivational interviewing and the science of hope, and how do you think about the relationship between the two?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. We're actually working, we've been working on this for about a year, is how to map that out for you very specifically of how they work together. And I just was looking to see if I could pull up a visual to show you, but I am somehow not capable of talking, thinking, and clicking buttons on a mouse. So give me a minute and let me see if I can find it. I think motivational interviewing is in fact the toolkit of willpower. I mean, I think it is. But I think that I certainly in MI, they understand that it's change for something in the future, right? But I think hope actually lets you have a little bit of a simpler language to think about change for what. So in hope work, I think that what we're doing is when we're doing MI work, we're using MI as a tool to activate hopeful thinking and the change that needs to happen for that future to become possible. So they're lovely in how they layer together. The other thing, though, is I think to some degree, I think hope is a little easier to wrap our heads around. I think MI is an incredible tool. I've learned it and practiced it myself since the first version of it came out in the late 90s. And I still have to really think through how am I doing my MI skill. But a peer mentor, for example, is much more likely to be able to come in and say, okay, so my job is to help people find goals, find ways to get there, and talk about that motivation and barriers to motivation. Like I can pick that up and go do that pretty easily with just a little help and a little coaching and some support. Versus MI is a much more clinical, quasi-clinical skill, right? I'm not saying only clinicians do it. I think drug counselors do it and all sorts of people use it. So one, I think they connect really well. And number two, I think sometimes what we need are a little bit even simpler strategies for people to go do this work in ways that we know move to outcomes we're looking for.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question.
One question, this came up earlier also, is there any way people can get a copy of the PowerPoint that you showed, or is it copyright protected?
It is all copyright protected. That doesn't mean I won't share a slide deck with you. I'm certainly happy to do that. Yep, that means I got to click some buttons while we're talking, but let me see if I can do that for us. And if I can, I'll drop them in the chat before we get off, because I don't have a way to email 136 of you a PowerPoint slide. So
thank you.
And if it's easier for you, if you just want to get one to Earl or Constance, okay, you can feel free to do that.
That is easier. Yes, that is easier. Let me do that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Other questions for Dr. Pharris?
We did a couple of parent cafes around the topic of hope. And I was wondering when I was doing them, is there any parent-friendly brochures, pamphlets that we could get, that we could give to parents that would kind of help nurture hope in their lives?
Yeah, if you'll go to Hope Rising, we'll try to put it USA. I think that's the website, or Hope Driven Parenting. Let me find it for you. So we've got an initiative here. It's actually through our governor's office and First Lady, where she's made this kind of one of her platforms. And one of the two primary ways she talks about hope is hope in parenting and hope in coaching. And so we've developed some tools and toolkits to teach hope to parents, and that parents can do, that they can actually use to teach their children to be hopeful. So ways you can do storytelling or activities, and that's all on that website. So let me get the correct website, but they're free and open to anyone who wants to do it.
A question came in: how can we be more consistent using this science while undergoing difficulty?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. How do you do hope? First of all, I have failed today. If you've walked out of here thinking that hope is the power of positive thinking, it's not. Hope is the thing you've had to activate in the hardest parts of your life. Right. So I think about all over your communities right now, there are people who are making a choice to admit themselves into substance abuse recovery programs. Let's use that as an example. And, even if it's not a place you work directly, moving from substance use withdrawal and all of that is suffering, right? To come off of an opioid, an addiction, as you check yourself in, I'm about to suffer, but I have to have a better future. And so I'm going to go suffer for a while because I think the future's possible, right? So like hope is this thing that you have to activate within yourself in order to move through some of the most difficult and extraordinary things you face in your life, right? What I think most of us need is the ability, one, to focus on the things I can control, right? Right now, it can get, not right now, in any phase of our life, it can be really hard when we have a lot of things that are happening that are out of our control. And so hope is the thing that I can control, the goals I can set for myself, the strategies I can use. But also is, how do I get to the future? What is the future I desire while I'm in this really hard place? So I think of hope as it's light in the tunnel. It's not at the end. It's, what does it need? What do I need today so that the future is possible? So it can be that's why coping, I think, comes up with hope. What we see in the research, right, is because when we start to drive our thoughts that way, we begin to imagine something's possible, even if it's just avoidance of more risk and more harm. Let me not mess this up, right? But again, keep in mind that this is something you have to nurture, that without it, your thoughts just get overwhelmed and you think nothing's possible and I don't even know how to solve this problem. So doing hope in the hard places is where you've probably done it the most. But when we get and teach you, and especially like if we can come in and teach your whole team to think this way, right? And this becomes like a core value of the work you do, then you're better able to help each other with it, right? Right now it happens because it's kind of a skill, a character strength that you have for yourself. Somebody taught you to be hopeful, but it's malleable. So it helps if we do it in community. Hope is a social gift, by the way. You don't learn anything in isolation, really. And so you learn to be hopeful from someone else and with others. And so hope is a social gift in that way.
And Greg, we'll be right with you. Okay, we have first from Mario Perez. Has there been any research or crosswalk between the hope levels of a case manager, teachers, and client outcomes? For example, does a staff member's own level of hope influence their effectiveness in fostering hope in their clients?
Yeah, thank you, Mario. That's a great question. Does my hope matter? So here's what we think. You can fake it for a little while. Because I think you do as a helper. There's days where you don't feel good and you're tired and weary and worn, and you come in and you just do it, right? And you do it well. I don't mean that in a critique at all. But I think at the end of the day, you can't give away what you don't have. And if hope is a driver of well-being, and I myself do not have hope, that's going to show up in profound ways that has to impact client outcomes, right? Like it has to. Now, are there times where people navigate around your hopelessness and they get things done in spite of you or without you? Absolutely, right? I think about maybe when I've gone to a doctor and they've kind of dismissed my concerns and I keep driving towards the goal with or without it, right? But for the most part, I think our client outcomes are going to be driven in part by our ability to imagine that the future is possible with somebody, and that to some degree, I can't do it unless I have it for myself. Do we have a lot of client driven outcomes? You know, it's harder to make that connection, but the big one I showed you was that we could see that the hope of youth in foster care was tied, intimately connected to the hopefulness of their caseworker, that the caseworker wasn't just hopeful themselves, by the way, but that they were signaling that to the young people. So yeah, I think it really matters. We'd love to continue to study client outcomes, but the research is there, right? When we nurture hope, suicidality goes down. Well, that's a client outcome. When we nurture hope, engagement in services goes up. Well, those are client outcomes. And so we feel like there's really strong evidence to support that claim, but you've got to be intentional about it together.
Okay, the next question, and then it's Greg. Is there a self-help book about hope that's aligned with your values?
Mm-hmm. So this is funny. So my colleague, Chan Hellman, along with Casey Gwynn, wrote a book about 8 years ago now called Hope Rising, How the Science of Hope Can Change Your Life. He very intentionally tried to not let it be a self-help book because he's a quantitative psychologist, but it's in self-help at Barnes and Noble. So I love the question for that reason. It's a lovely book. You can grab it on Amazon for like $12. It walks back through a lot of this with a storytelling approach. So it's not scientific. It's really easy to access and get to. Hope is also part of a larger array of different strengths that we know impact our well-being. And so things like Clifton Strengths Finders can be a really good way if you want to kind of see where your hope is, and look at hope in the context of gratitude and courage and bravery and empowerment and all the other things you have. There's some good resources there, but I would drive you over to that book. I think is just a great place to start.
Greg.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for coming. A lot of good information. Thank you on the science of hope.
Thank
I have
you.
a question. You mentioned about women that you guys work with in the in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
and that the numbers have been increasing. Do you have you guys did a focus group? Is it a weekly that you guys are in a weekly, or is it just one focus group? And then is there any material that you guys are using for the women who are incarcerated? And then another question is a short question. Men, have you been working with any men who are incarcerated and doing the same process with them as well? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So first of all, as a researcher, we go where we're invited. So sometimes it's they invited us into the women's prison, and the DOC hasn't invited us into the men's prisons yet. I think they want to. I think they just saw that as a better fit to how they approach programs and services in our two. We have two women's prisons here, so we don't really have any work with men, but there's no theoretical reason that it doesn't work the same way, right? And in, by the way, the thousands of studies, we've tested that there's not a bias in this description or how we define it or anything like that. So what happens in the women's prison is we come in, we train their staff on what hope is, and then they get to work in figuring out what are the strategies they're going to use to nurture hope. So for example, in our women's prison at intake, there's about a 2-week period of time where you are held. It's really basically health screening to make sure you're not bringing TB and things they don't want to spread across the prison population. So they decided that would be a hope nurturing time. So during those 2 weeks where they're kind of in quasi medical isolation, they watch videos on hope science. They have book readings that people come in and talk about, because they're focusing on adaptation to prison life. Like what are the goals you can set for yourself just while you're here? What do you want tomorrow to look like? How do you have some sense of control again? And then throughout things like the school programming and other programs, they do activities that are based off this. So there's some worksheets and things that we've co-created with them. So it's these little doses of hope all the way through the time there. So maybe they're part of a team that does poetry. An outsider comes in and does poetry writing, and they do hope writing for a while. So no, I don't have a curriculum to give you, but I think what we do is we teach you how to take the way you're already approaching client services and think about how would we do hope in that. So another one, we had a substance abuse recovery program where they've just added this in. They teach hope, talk about hope. They practice goal setting with people while they're in this residential recovery program. And we kind of come along and help them figure out how to do that. But yeah, we've been building this with people so that it isn't a here's just go do this hope thing. It's more of what would this look like in your community, in your practices. We do have one research study on diversion programs, though, and we could see, and which is largely men, and we could see in that study that when hope is nurtured among men in diversion programs, they do better program participation. Side note, I'm very hesitant to track recidivism. I think recidivism is a messy statistic. I understand from a community standpoint, we don't want to see reincarceration. But I also worked in mental health court, and I know we would meet people who'd been arrested 80 times in the last 4 years, and we get them down to being arrested 5 times. And in a recidivism output, that was a failure. And that is not a failure in any day in any book, right? So as a researcher, we don't study that as much, but thank you.
We have about 3 more, and we're coming down to the wire here. We had one, Karen Burke said that she noticed on one of the later graphs that the moderate and the high hope still had the greater percentage of high scoring ACEs, and resiliency and natural optimism play a role there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Trauma and adversity play a role in your hopeful thinking, right? So if you've had a lot of trauma, you are in fact more likely to show up in the lower hope categories than the higher hope. But as compared to your peers who've had no trauma, right? So zero ACEs are more likely to be very hopeful kids. Let me also step back though and say this: in the Gallup research, where they study all kids in the United States, or it's usually a sample of like 50,000, 75,000 kids, which is a representative sample usually. They actually find overall that only about 45% of kids right now report and score as high hope. So we've got a hope crisis in my mind. If all kids are only scoring at 45% hopeful, then that means we're not teaching the skill. It's not that our world is more doomsday than it's ever been, although you can make a case that they have a lot more access to that than they've ever had. It's that it's a skill that's being taught, and it's not included in how we're teaching and equipping our children right now. And so I think there's work to be done across all kids. But the second part of that, do resiliency and optimism play a role? So absolutely. And we never want to get into like a hope versus some other positive characteristic, right? Like they're all good for us. We know though that resiliency is a different measure. And so that capacity to bounce back, that when I face adversity, I come back and pursue the goal. I personally think resiliency is very likely a component of willpower. Can I use coping skills and adaptation and things like that to keep going even when things have been hard? The other thing about resiliency is from just a research perspective, we're actually not sure how to teach you to be resilient. I mean, I think that there's times where I understand as a parent and a clinician, like, here's how I'm going to nurture the resiliency in my kid, right? But like there's not like a universal definition of it. What I'm not sure when I look at resiliency is, can I learn to be resilient without adversity present? That's kind of the big question, right? There's a fundamental bounce back piece of it. So some adversity had to happen. Versus with hope, I can teach you to be hopeful as a buffer so that when adversity happens, you're better prepared to be able to think about what that future is and what you want. And you're more likely to be willing to bounce back. Here's what we've done. We've actually tested this a lot. We've got 4 or 5 published studies on hope and resiliency and how they're different. We believe hope is the mindset that drives resilient behavior. So if what you ultimately need is children or families to be resilient, if you nurture hope, because people don't just bounce back, they bounce back once they believe that the future can be better. And so if you want them to use that bounce back, whatever that is, that thing, nurture their hope with it, and you'll see kind of that needle move a little different. That's a great question. And hope is different from optimism and self-efficacy too. So yeah, so that's a great question. Hope is the mindset that drives resilient behavior.
One last thing. Is there a difference in hope-related outcomes in working with folks on short-term versus long-term goals?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I didn't really cover that very well in the talk. When we're in adversity, we need short-term goal setting. All of us do, right? But people who have chronic, repetitive stress in their lives need a lot of help with short-term goal setting. It's probably one of your superpowers. You know that, and you do a really good job with it. It is it is really hard to do long-term goal setting if my hope hasn't been taught and nurtured along with it. The idea, like, if you meet a teenager, usually as teenagers, they don't tell you, it's when they become an adult and they can look back on their lives, right? But they'll say, I didn't think I'd live past 22 anyway. So when you'd come in and talk to me about school, that meant nothing to me. And so that idea of, as we continue to build the skill of thinking and having an expectation that my future can be better, because it's a skill process we learn, then you are more likely to be able to begin to set long-term goals. So it starts with today, this week, but where do we begin to think about this month? And it's a progressive skill building set we learn throughout our hope skill building. It's a wonderful question. Thank you. All right.
I know that we have more and more questions. Unfortunately, we're just, down to the wire here time-wise. How do you talk to one last one? I swear this is it. I hope you have enough time to answer.
It's a good question, though. I'm glad we're going to do it.
How do you talk to policymakers regarding implementing structural changes and policies for increasing hope in families and staff?
Yeah, thank you. I think hope is one of the most wonderful, beautiful, universal human conditions. People study hope in Beijing, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Turkey, Iran. Some of my favorite researchers, she's down in Portugal. So hope is this universal thread among us as human beings. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about our differences and could probably benefit from looking at our similarities a little more. So hope is this wonderful thread between us. But that's kind of ideological, and policymakers, are like, that's great. But where we usually go in and talk to policymakers and decision makers is we show them the data. We show them hey, if rising cost of healthcare is what's driving down what's the problem they're trying to solve? And how do we bring research in line to show them that this fixes the problem? So for me, and usually all I have to do is show child welfare leadership that we could see a 28% reduction in turnover intent among people who were hopeful than people who are low hope. And if turnover is your big problem, let me show you that data. Intent to remain goes up. If rising cost of healthcare is the problem in your community, let me show you how, if we teach people to nurture hope, healthcare outcomes improve. So it's, when you want to talk to policymakers and things like that, it really kind of moves away from that ideological thing. Although it's unfortunate, I think we should be able to do it and get into what are the problems they're trying to solve, and how can we show and that we can move the needle on that problem by also influencing hopeful thinking. Retention of teachers, I think we could probably have a great conversation. There's a lot of things teachers need, including pay and pay equity and all sorts of things, but also making hope a core value of a school improves teacher satisfaction with their work. It's the way they got in the work in the first place. So that's how we talk about it.
Well, Dr. Pharris, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate all the insights you've shared with us on how we can be much more effective for those who serve. But what was also important is the many instances of ways that we can be there for each other in this work. So we appreciate it. We appreciate everything you're doing to integrate this into practice. And you have certainly given us a lot to think about. So thank you for your time. We'll make sure to make the slide available with the recording of the presentation that Dr. Pharris shares with us. So you should probably watch that for that on the Connection Hub. We'll make that available to folks, as well as any staff who weren't able to join us. They can watch that and hopefully pick up their CEUs. Thank you, Dr. Pharris. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate it.